Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3. This week, we are going to cover our introduction to trauma. And while I have done my best to cut this lecture down pretty significantly from its original, probably around 40 slides to about 16, it will maybe be long. I'm not super sure yet how long it will end up being, but feel free to pause it at any time if you need a break. All right, let's get started. So our objectives today is to talk about what is trauma, the major types of trauma, and the effects of trauma. And that will include neurobiology, memory, and affective, behavioral, and cognitive impacts. And if you've already read your chapter, I did talk a good bit about the relational impact. And so I won't be talking as much about that because I thought it was covered pretty well in your textbook. I'm going to try to focus on things that I think need a little more attention. So what makes an event traumatic? If we go back to the DSM-5 definition, it really talks about exposure to actual or threatened things. So actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence through direct exposure, so it happens to yourself, witnessing it, you see it happen to somebody else, learning about something like this happening to somebody that you're close to, including a violent or accidental death, and then also repeated or extreme exposure to details of the event. Now, I do want to say that this is the DSM definition for diagnosis. Sometimes folks experience a trauma and they may not meet every single criteria that you could say, okay, this person has, acute traumatic injury to them, or they have post-traumatic stress disorder specifically, but they are still experiencing traumatic symptoms. So when a client does have some of the symptoms, but not all of them, you may not be able to give them a diagnosis related to trauma. However, you would still want to treat the trauma. And so that's very important to remember as you learn about trauma through this entire course. And as you move into the future, just because someone does not meet all of the DSM criteria does not mean that you would not treat the trauma that they are presenting with. All right. So crisis versus trauma, I talked about this a little bit in the first week, but this is just a reminder that when someone is exposed to a traumatic event, it will often result in a crisis, but not always. Sometimes that will look like, if the traumatic event is something like a one-time event, car crash that the person walks away from, but their car is totaled and they may have either some residual trauma related to driving in cars or being in cars. They may also have some sort of crisis around money because we know that people aren't always able to replace things easily, especially large purchases like a car. So there could be multiple types of crisis that could involve in a traumatic event. However, not all crises are traumatic, and in the same example, we could say in the car wreck that someone may not have any trauma symptoms. They may have a monetary crisis, but they are able to help get extra resources through you or other, maybe their insurance or their family members, and move past it and do not have trauma symptoms. So these things, if you look at a Venn diagram, they do overlap, but they're not always exactly overlapping. It will depend on the case and the person. So it's important to talk about what normative responses are to trauma, and that's not to dismiss any response to trauma. We always want to be sensitive and treatment oriented to any response, but we also want to know what our baselines are, which is really important. A trauma response is a normal reaction to an abnormal event, and that happens in your brain, it happens in your body. Those get translated into your behavior and your thoughts. And so, your mannerisms, your normal everyday life is going to look really different, but we need to remember that you are reacting to an abnormal event. And that's okay. We expect that of people, right? To have reactions to abnormal events. And there's no timeline or expected timeline for people to deal with these events. However, when we look at research, most folks who are exposed to some sort of traumatic event return to baseline within about a year, which means our bodies and our brains have a natural ability and resilience to heal. which is good news, right? That doesn't mean that they couldn't use some help in their healing process, and that also doesn't mean that treatment wouldn't kind of speed that up. But it is, I think, good to know that we can like trust our bodies and our minds to assist with the healing process when we're not talking about severe or chronic circumstances. So once again, normative responses do not mean that the client doesn't need treatment. It just means that all of this needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about how you want to plan your treatment. Timelines, expectations, things like that. So what are some major types of trauma? I tried to divide these up here in between sort of like people related. It's not a perfect list. It's very difficult to separate some things from like individual people versus sort of like natural disasters. So there's a lot of overlap here, and I did not do a perfect job on separating those two lists. But in general, you do have things that are more related to personhood. And so those would be things like child abuse, interpersonal violence or IPV, intimate partner violence, physical assault, rape or sexual assault, and sex trafficking. And then also severe medical conditions. Medical trauma is a specialty area that really is coming forth, that we're learning more about and people are taking more seriously, because whether it's sort of a one-time medical procedure or chronic medical procedures, there's a lot of mental trauma that can come out of those. And then you can see that I kind of skipped torture, because now that I look at this list again, I think that maybe it belongs over here. So these are sort of in the second column, things that are outside of maybe personhood that are due to outside events. And so torture often goes with war, not always, but it can. And then we have things like natural disasters, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, mudslides, things like that. Transportation accidents, which can be either individual or a mass transportation accident, which unfortunately, often we see in the news when things like buses flip, or if there's a large pileup on a highway. Fires can be considered a natural disaster. They can also be considered a personal disaster if it's a house fire that's limited to one house. Exposure to suicide or homicide, and this kind of goes hand in hand with traumatic grief, which we'll talk about later in the term. But these can also be types of trauma. And then vicarious exposure, which can happen to you as a mental health professional. It can also happen to folks who work in ERs, paramedics, firefighters, and other folks who witness kind of broadly the amount of trauma that there is in the world on a daily basis. I would say the military are included in that, and any kind of first responders that you can think of. So trauma is a type of stress on the brain. And we know that stress can be good in some instances. A moderate amount of stress can keep us motivated. It can help us remember to turn our assignments in on time. It can help us take care of things that we need to. But long-term and chronic trauma really can affect the brain through stress. And that's particularly apparent when we look at things like child abuse and child neglect, where the brain simply just does not grow at the level that you would expect it to. There's also not the same amount of like neural firing and functioning in the brain that you would also expect. So what I would like for you to do here is pause my video and open up the video, How Stress Impacts Your Brain. That is for you in your Canvas page. Also, if you have this lecture open, just the slides, not the narration, there should be a link that you can click where it says watch video. So whatever is easier for you, go ahead and pause and watch that video and think about how that may expand even more to when we think about trauma's impact on the brain. All right, I'm going to assume that you watched the video. We are back. We're going to move into a second part of today's mini lecture where we're going to talk about neurobiology. So what happens in the brain during and after trauma. Now, if science is not your strong point, that's okay. I will, say it wasn't always my strong point. I did okay in everything but physics, but it's hard to remember all of the different components of the brain. Please know that you don't need to memorize these things, but it is important for you to know and for you to be able to come back to, because it should inform your treatment planning, it should inform your case conceptualization, and it should help you psychoeducate your clients on what's happening in their brain and in their body. So one easy way to think about the brain is the brain-hand model. And there is a video that I'll ask you to watch in just a moment by Dr. Dan Siegel, where he talks about this in reference to, coaching or treating parents, how to talk to their kids about what's going on in their brain. So I think that this is a great illustration, and it's very easy to use, easy to learn. I think it's good for adult clients. I've used it with adults and with kids and explaining, on a very basic level what happens in their brain. Particularly when folks get stuck in fight or flight or freeze, and they're using more of their brain stem, lower brain, is making the decisions instead of their prefrontal cortex. So go ahead and pause me again and watch the brain hand model video, either in Canvas or on the slides. All right, hopefully you're back now and you've watched that. Save that YouTube video. It's so, so, so helpful in talking to clients. So put a link to that somewhere, save it, memorize it for yourself. I think that it is one of the most helpful ways that you will have in talking to your clients about their brain. All right, it looks like my picture isn't showing up here, but I can see it in my other presentation. So I am going to pause. I'm actually going to share a different screen for a moment. Pivot. I'm going to pivot. All right, so now you should be able to see the picture that was on the slide that wasn't showing up. And this is a picture of what different parts of the brain do normally, and then also how they respond to trauma. And I'm going to talk about this briefly, but also please feel free to read through it yourself. This is also a great slide to save because I think it provides a lot of helpful information that builds off of the brain hand model that you just learned. So let's start with the prefrontal cortex. So this is the thinking part of your brain. This is the decision-making part, and it plans all of your behavior, how you express yourself and make decisions. It also helps us have self-control. So if you have ever, had any sort of substance, whether that's alcohol or other substances, you know that that's the part of the brain that typically comes offline first. We don't have as much self-control. We don't make as good decisions when that part of the brain is inhibited. And trauma does something that's fairly similar. It inhibits control over like that stress and emotion reactivity, which means that we're more likely to be stressed out. We're more likely to have emotional reactivity when we are experiencing a trauma or trauma symptoms after the trauma occurs. So moving over here to the right to the thalamus, this part of the brain helps you understand the data that's coming in. So the sensory data, which includes your sight, sounds, smells, all of that. It sends it to the prefrontal cortex and gives them meaning. And that's really important when we start talking about memory, which we will soon. During times of trauma and trauma symptoms, the thalamus can get overwhelmed. The intensity and quantity of the sensory data doesn't make sense, so it isn't processed as it normally would. And what results is kind of a mixed up collection of the information that came in during that time. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. And then let's talk about the hippocampus. So again, in normal times, it helps process that sensory information into memory. So kind of going from the thalamus to the hippocampus. It's very sensitive to hormone fluctuations, which can happen during trauma, but not just trauma, flashbacks, any sort times that we have intense trauma symptoms, we may get those hormone fluctuations. So the hippocampus is very sensitive to the problems that can occur during trauma. And so during trauma, you have decreased neurogenesis, which results in memory impairment. And then moving over to the amygdala, that's what we have left, which is our arousal and emotion center of the brain. And when it's, you know, just sort of normally functioning, it processes our emotions, it integrates that into memory, and makes meaning. However, during trauma, it's not sure how to code things. Is this traumatic? Is it not traumatic? Is it bad? Is it good? So the context of how memories are stored gets kind of mixed up. All right. So now I'm going to change my share again. Go back to the other presentation. All right. So let's talk a bit about the hypothalamus. This is an area that you can kind of see the thalamus is around it. The hypothalamus is right here in the middle. The hippocampus is close to it, and the amygdala is close to it. And so all of these parts of the brain tend to be related, and they work together. And when things are good, when things are quote unquote normal, and you're not having extreme hormonal fluctuations, everything is working in harmony. And so the hypothalamus helps regulate your hormones. It helps that homeostasis, everything kind of stays the same. It controls your autonomic nervous system. And if you're not sure what that is, that's the part of your brain that helps you do the things that you do without thinking, like breathing and maintaining your temperature, getting sleep, things like that. And it's home of the HPA axis and initiates the stress response. So this is the kind of fire alarm of the brain. So it is important to think about how the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is our stress response, but it's the fire alarm, and then it's also what's responsible for bringing our system back to normal. And it uses hormones and chemicals to help it do that. And during trauma, these hormones and chemicals can get quite unbalanced. And so there might be fluctuations of hormones, fluctuations of chemicals that can cause things like irrational thought. It can cause a flat affect, reduced energy, increased hyperactivity. It can also cause things like catatonia, like shut down, your body completely shutting down, which we see in sort of extreme cases of trauma, but it also works in that impairment of memory processing. And so lots of things can go wrong when these areas of the brain are not regulated and in homeostasis for our normal functioning. So you can probably understand, after we've talked a little bit about brain science, that this is complicated. Our brains are responding, whether the threat is real or perceived, whether, you know, our perception of the event is severe, but others might not agree with that. Our body responds based on our perception of it. And we as clinicians need to make sure that we defer to how the client is responding, how they're perceiving the event, how their body is processing it, and not based on others' assessment of like the severity of the trauma or the severity of the event that may have caused the trauma. So it's very personal. And a little bit about trauma and memory, which I just alluded to. I think this is one of the most important takeaways that I hope you will remember from this lecture. Haha, remember memory. Maybe that will help you remember. So when we experience a trauma, the hippocampus is not working properly. And so typically it will take the information, it will turn them into memories. The amygdala processes those and adds emotion. Both of these structures, however, are very sensitive to hormonal fluctuations. And so if and trauma is occurring, let's say someone is being assaulted, the normal things that your body and brain would take in and code get all jumbled up, essentially. And so we see that in survivor reports, and there's a video later on that I'm going to have you watch that talks a little bit about that. But many times survivors of trauma are not held as credible because they can't remember things. We know that that's just simply not true anymore. We know that the trauma to your brain is what causes the memory blips or memories to be stored incorrectly. Sometimes those memories come back during flashbacks, nightmares. Sometimes there are things that we would call triggers that will cause those memories to come back, and that could be something that seems very unrelated to another person. But to the person that experienced the trauma, it could be a specific smell. If the assault was occurring and the person who was doing the assault smelled a certain way, let's say they smelled like citrus, and then the survivor smelled citrus later, it could trigger a memory. And so when you hear the word triggers, that's specifically what we're talking about, this biological process of something in your memory, in your brain, being brought back by something that's sensory. And it's often a sight, a sound, a smell that will bring back these memories in a disjointed way. And so it could take months or even years, and sometimes never, for all of those memories to come back, and you as the counselor help the client facilitate the process of putting that story together in the way that makes sense. But I'm jumping ahead into treatment, so I'll get back on track. One of my favorite ways to think about memory and how memory is stored is illustrated through the movie Inside Out. It's not very sciencey, but I like it anyway because I think that it boils it down for us and for our clients to think about how our brain sometimes doesn't always do what we expect it to do, even when we're not experiencing trauma. So you can see in the videos that the memories are organized by either a feeling, so they're coded by a color, and then they're kind of classified into personality traits. And hopefully, if you haven't seen this movie, this will make you want to go and watch it, because I believe the second one is coming out or has already come out. So as a counselor who worked with kids, I can't wait to go see it. Anyway. So imagine if your brain wasn't sure where to group or store the memories. They're there, but you're not sure where they are. They're not where you expect them to be. And this is why survivors often have those memories that come back in fragments and flashbacks when prompted by the triggers that I talked about. It is very important to note that, those increased stress hormones impairs the function in your hippocampus, which creates fragmented memories, and then memory activation is unpredictable and can actually re-traumatize a client when that happens. And so part of our job as counselors is to help prepare clients for those things, because it will often happen when they're not in session. So you'll learn things like grounding, you'll learn things like mindfulness. These are really, really important first interventions right after psychoeducation. You want to go to coping through grounding, through mindfulness, to really help your clients be prepared for when things come back. Oh, so please pause the video here and watch the 2 Inside Out clips, Making Memories and Mind Workers, and then come back. All right, so what are the enduring effects of trauma? So first, trauma disrupts the rhythm of your brain and body, and it causes the thinking part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, to disconnect. And many times the lower parts of your brain take over, and it can be confusing and disorienting for a person. Second, the neural pathways that the trauma impacted are reinforced because the person is literally stuck in their perpetual state of fear, which can also lead to dissociation. And if you still aren't sure what dissociation means, that's kind of separating from yourself. If you've ever felt numb, if you've ever not been able to sort of think about yourself in first person, that is dissociation. On a much lower level, dissociation is something like, you're driving the same route that you drive every day. And maybe one day you realize, oh, I'm home already. And you couldn't even remember the specifics of what the drive included. That's also dissociation, but that's more about sort of just rote memory activities, but still a type of dissociation. And so think about that in a more extreme version of dissociation. And then brain changes will include disorganization. So we just talked about memory disorganization, hyperarousal and hyperactivity. So that jumpiness, that feeling like you never know what's coming or what's going on. And then the inability to contextualize. And I talked about this a little bit earlier. One thing that trauma does to us is it takes away the ability to be able to know, okay, like, well, even though this person looks like the person who attacked me, I know that they aren't. The logical part of my brain, the thinking part, knows that like every 6 foot tall man is not my attacker. In my body and in my brain, I cannot contextualize safety versus non-safety. And so that's also part of the work that we have to do with survivors of trauma, is help their brain start recontextualizing and learning safety versus lack of safety, specifically lack of safety during their trauma. So 3 primary implications of trauma and its toll: the body and mind are stuck in a perpetual state of threat. And I will just add, a person can't think themselves out of this. When your brain is not doing what it's supposed to do, it doesn't matter how strong you are, it doesn't matter how determined you are, it doesn't matter what your cultural beliefs are about seeking help. Your brain is stuck, and you need assistance to move out of that. The second is the brain is unable to filter information temporally and contextually. So time and context don't make a lot of sense. And this can lead to confusion and some circumstances where it's not scared, but then it can also lead to a lot of fear, overgeneralization, like the example that I talked about in the last slide. And then both of these factors result in an impaired sense of self and a disconnection from the body. And so over time, if these things aren't healed, if help is not sought, if the trauma stays in your body, a person will often feel like they don't know themselves anymore, and they will feel very disconnected from who they are in their brain, but also from their body. And so as we move forward, we're going to address these areas, right? So we can't just address the brain, we can't just address the body, we have to address both so that a person can holistically heal. And then I believe this is the last video that I'm going to ask you to watch in this lecture. It is the video Trauma, the Brain and Memories. It is from a law enforcement perspective, but I think that it's a really great educational video that talks about why folks can't understand or remember like what time something happens or the timeline within a traumatic event. I think it helps relay an understanding of how things can come back to a client in different spaces based on triggers. So this is all important, not because you're going into law enforcement, but because you may be working with them and you want to be able to understand your clients. You want to be able to talk to your clients and help educate them about what's happening within themselves. And then you also want to empower your clients to actively heal themselves. Many of us have, an innate readiness to heal, even with severe trauma, but we need others around us to support us, to help us walk through, to help us rebuild the pieces. And your book really focuses on the relational aspect, and I heartily agree with that. I didn't cover that a lot because I know that it does a good job of covering it, but that relationship that you can build in counseling can be a huge foundational block in moving forward from trauma. So I'm going to move forward to this slide because it's the last one, but please do make sure after you turn this video off that you go back and watch the last video that I mentioned. And then of course there are some other resources in your Canvas page if you'd like to look at those. Thank you for your time. I do have some list of references if you'd like them. Happy to send those to you, and please reach out with any questions, either in your note cards or on your big discussion board. All right, thanks y'all.